Gospel according to Matthew. Jesus said to his disciples, "As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be the coming of the Son of Man. In those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, up to the day that Noah entered the ark. They did not know until the flood came and carried them all away. So will it be also at the coming of the Son of Man. 2 men will be out in the field, one will be taken, and one will be left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken, and one will be left. Therefore stay awake, for you do not know on which day your Lord will come. Be sure of this. If the master of the house had known the hour of night when the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and not let his house be broken into. So too, you also must be prepared, for at an hour you do not expect, the Son of Man will come." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Well, appreciate those warm and fuzzy words of Jesus this morning, huh? In the Gospel, right? Jesus speaking about the second coming and judgment. I'm not going to talk about that today or during Advent. However, I do want everybody to know I'm actually going to be giving a presentation tomorrow night at Wabash College on the book of Revelation, right? So on the apocalypse. So it'll be a 2-part series. It'll be tomorrow night and then the following Monday. We sent out a flock note about that. That's at Center Hall at Wabash College. If you want to come and attend, you'll be more than welcome. Advent is an amazing time of the year. It's a beautiful time of the year. It's my favorite time. Many of us, sometimes we kind of let Advent pass us by. And so I just want to encourage you to try to enter into the spirit of Advent, right? So a couple of suggestions for entering into the spirit of Advent. Right? During the season of Lent, we tend to see that as a penitential season. So often we give things up for Lent. I want to encourage you, Advent is a great time to add things, right? Advent is a time to spiritually prepare yourself for Christ's coming. So a great thing you could do if you don't pray the rosary every day, try to pray the rosary every day during Advent. Make a weekly visit to the Blessed Sacrament if you're not already in the habit of doing so. Maybe during the season of Advent, read through the readings at Mass every day. And Advent is a great spiritual time to prepare ourselves for the coming of Christ. And just one pointer that I always like to share too, some of us, the reason why we aren't able to enter into the spirit of Advent is because we're so focused on Christmas, right? We have Christmas parties, we have Christmas shopping, and all those things to do. A great thing I learned when I was in Noblesville is the youth minister there, he and his family, every year they decided that instead of doing their Christmas shopping during Advent, their rule was they had to have all their Christmas shopping done before the first Sunday of Advent. Right? A great rule of thumb. So if you're not there right now, maybe you can try to get it all done this first week of Advent, right? So you can forget about that and spiritually prepare yourself for the coming of Christ. Here at St. Bernard, one of my habits during Advent and Lent is I always try to give a series of homilies on a specific topic, mainly because the readings repeat themselves, right, week after week. And so there's only so much you can talk about spiritual preparations, right? So I tend to do a series. And this year, what I want to talk about is I'd like to give a homily series about famous conversions to the Catholic Church, right? One of the dominant ideas in our culture today is that Christianity, and Catholicism especially, is seen as sort of like an antique of a distant past, right? Some people see it as like a superstition. There are 2 main philosophers who are influential in this idea, right? There's a famous philosopher in the 1800s. He famously said that God is dead, right? Who was the person who said God is dead? Who knows? A little trivia from history, right? Remember Friedrich Nietzsche, right? Friedrich Nietzsche famously said, "God is dead and we have killed him, and therefore we must go beyond our traditional understandings of good and evil," right? That's literally what his book was called. So a bunch of modern philosophers, right, they basically said that God has become discredited And now we've moved into the age of knowledge and science. We move beyond these ancient superstitions. It's a very common thinking in our culture today, right? Whether people admit it or not. Right? Now, what I think is very interesting about this is that at the very same time that these secular atheistic philosophies have become so dominant in our culture, there's actually a really big movement of very intellectual, intelligent people who are actually giving up on those atheistic philosophies and actually returning to this ancient superstition, right, that we call the church. And I think there's a lot of beautiful things that we can learn from some of these conversions, right? So the first person I want to talk about this morning is, I actually have a picture of him. So how about James and Sawyer, can you come on up here? Show this picture. I'm full of all sorts of trivia questions today, all right? I'm going to ask you guys, does anybody recognize who this person is? And I'll give you a hint. He's not a saint. He's not a blessed. Are there any literature fanatics in here? He's a famous writer. He died in the early 1900s. Oscar Wilde is this person's name. How many people were thinking that? Right? A lot of you probably recognize him, right? Oscar Wilde, right? Now, Oscar Wilde is a very interesting person from history. Oscar Wilde is actually held up by many people in our culture today as kind of a model of like a liberator, right, from these ancient ideas of ancient morality that we used to hold in the church. Right? Oscar Wilde famously, even though he was married and had children, he also had same-sex attraction and acted on it many times. He actually ended up going to prison for a couple of years because of this, because in those days it was actually illegal where he lived, right? And so many people in the LGBTQ movement, they kind of see him as like this hero, right? Who was a liberator of these ancient moral standards, right? And he suffered for it, right? And so they kind of hold him up as this example. He was a member of a group of intellectuals that called themselves the Decadents, right? So decadence, you guys know what that means, right? Basically like debauchery and debaseness, right? And these thinkers kind of prided themselves on this. They prided themselves on the philosophy of saying that since God has now been discredited, right, so has the church, and therefore why should we be following any of these ancient moral standards, right? They agreed with Sigmund Freud, who said that one of the biggest problems in culture is that people have been repressing those desires, and it's leading them to unhappiness and despair. So these decadent intellectuals said rather than following these ancient moral standards that simply are repressing our deepest desires, we need to instead throw away all those moral chains and act on the things that we want. And so you can imagine the kind of lifestyles they lived. Actually, Oscar Wilde actually died at a very young age because he had acquired an illness from this lifestyle. Right? So what's interesting about him is that even though he was a part of this group of thinkers called the Decadents, who were very influential in his day, even though many modern thinkers, especially along that same line of thinking, hold him up as this hero, right? What many of them don't realize is that Oscar Wilde himself, he didn't see himself as a hero at all. Actually, he saw this battle that he had within himself his whole life as his personal pathology. He saw his whole life that he was struggling with the debaseness of some of his natural desires and wanting to live to a higher standard. Oscar Wilde actually was received into the Catholic Church on his deathbed. And actually, for most of his life, he had actually wanted to become a Catholic. But in the days that he was alive, it was still very taboo to become Catholic in England. And so his father was extremely against it. His father told Oscar when he was in college, when he was thinking about becoming Catholic, he said that if he had converted, he would lose all of his inheritance. And so Oscar Wilde saw that as a great suffering in his life. Unfortunately for him, after that happened, right, he ended up getting married and having children. And on his honeymoon, he discovered one of these books written by these decadent thinkers. And he said later on in his life that it was like a poison that consumed him and changed his whole outlook on life and led him into such a debased existence that he had after that. Right? And it was anything but glorious. Right? Imagine what it was like for his family and for his children when he was living that promiscuous lifestyle, right? Often on the streets. Right? He didn't consider it something heroic. Something else that's kind of interesting about the life of Oscar Wilde is that so many of those thinkers who actually influenced him, who led him into this lifestyle, 3 of those major decadent writers, all 3 of them actually ended up becoming Catholic before the end of their life. They all recognized the emptiness of those pursuits that they lived, and they ended up as Catholic. Perhaps the most well-known person, Oscar Wilde, maybe his most famous novel is called The Picture of Dorian Gray. He named it after this man named John Gray, who had become friends with. And John Gray actually later in life, not only did he convert to Catholicism, but he actually went to Rome and studied to be a Catholic priest and ended his life as a Catholic priest. They saw through the emptiness of these pursuits, right, and came back to the church. Oscar Wilde, a beautiful thing that he said shortly before his death, he was giving an interview about his life, and he said that his greatest regret was that his father had prohibited him from becoming a Catholic. Because if he had become Catholic in his youth, right, the beauty of the church's teachings and the beauty of the liturgical atmosphere would have helped heal his sinful and debased desires. And he recognized that. The influence the church could have had on him, if only his father hadn't prevented it. Beautiful story, right? About a return of a prodigal son. I think there's many things that we can learn from this, right? First and foremost, we can learn from Oscar Wilde and these other men, right? These people who seem to be the greatest enemies of the church, all of them eventually humbled themselves and came back. You guys heard me a few months ago. I talked about the famous actor Shia LaBeouf, right? Who was also lost for a number of years and now has recently become Catholic through the influence of St. Padre Pio. Some of you might remember another homily I gave a few weeks ago when I shared how Lady Gaga, right? How when she was first starting her public career, right? Very much outside of the church's boundaries and everything. Now she actually goes to Mass regularly. Right? We have this tendency to look at the decadent people, right, in our town and our cultures and to think, they're the enemies. They're on the outside. We need to spend a lot more time praying for those people that they might come back home, back to Christ, back to the church. Nobody is ever too far gone, right, to be humbled and experience a deep conversion. I also think there's something beautiful about this story of Oscar Wilde, about how honest he was about the inner turmoil he had throughout his life, right? And the role the church could have played there, right? Every single one of us, hopefully, is not quite as bad as Oscar Wilde and the decadents, right? But all of us have these base parts of ourselves that we hate about ourselves, that we would be embarrassed if anybody else knew about. And one of the major themes of our existence is this attempt of God to lift us out of that filth, right? The worst parts of ourselves. They call us to something higher. The last thing I think that is really beautiful about the story of Oscar Wilde is the influence that he saw the church could have had. Again, so many people in our modern culture, and even many of us, can give in this mentality of thinking, why is there so many structures? Why are there so many rules? Why is the church always telling me what to do? Some people unconsciously think of this church as this institution that is just constantly repressing people. Oscar Wilde saw the church as the complete opposite. He saw that in the midst of a sinful and fallen world, humanity desperately needs some institution, some place that we can call home that will call us to something higher, right? Overcoming our selfish and sinful desires and calling us to a life of beautiful sanctity and self-sacrifice. That every time we come to Mass, we are not merely members of the church, but rather we are taken up into the heavenly liturgy. And we commune with the angels and the saints. And we look up to Christ, the great example, the most beautiful love and self-sacrifice. The church is not something that keeps people down. The church is something that lifts us up. It's beautiful. And we see that in the church's teachings. We see it in the church's liturgy, right? When the liturgy is actually done well and with dignity. We see it in churches, right? When churches are built well. One of the terrible things about so many modern churches is that now they're built so horizontal rather than vertically, right? Calling us up with the lifted sanctuaries, the lifted high altars, right? The tall ceilings. That was the whole idea of those ancient churches, is lifting us up. Right? And it's sad that so many modern churches are built, right, in a different way. The church is anything but the disease in our world. The church is the antidote to all of our problems. And especially in our modern culture, which is so much falling into sinfulness and despair, we are in desperate